Hi everyone, I'm Jacob Lackner, and it's Thursday, so that means it's time for a new video on Nizahone history. In today's video, I'm looking to dispel one of the big misconceptions about the Crusades that people often have, the idea that it was a clash between Islamic and Christian civilizations. In particular, I'm going to discuss several examples of military alliances that were formed between Muslims and Christians during the era of the Crusades. In short, we'll see that the Crusades are far more complicated than just wars between Muslims and Christians, and indeed, Muslims and Christians often work together to achieve similar goals. Before we get to the alliances, let me do a quick rundown of the Crusades and why they occurred. This is something I may do a whole video on at a later point, but for now, here's a quick summary. The First Crusade occurred largely as a result of the rise of the Seljuk Turks, who had converted to Islam right around 1000. They began conquering large swaths of land from both Christian and Muslim powers, by the way. Among their conquests was the city of Jerusalem and the Levant more generally, which they conquered from the Fatimid Caliphate, an Islamic state. Muslims had ruled Jerusalem since the late 7th century, and during most of that time, Christians were welcome to make pilgrimages to the holy city. The Seljuks were less welcoming than their predecessors, and pilgrimage became difficult for European Christians, which upset them because it was a big part of their religious devotion, especially for the nobility. They also began defeating the Christian Byzantine Empire in battle after battle and conquered most of Asia Minor until the point that the Byzantine Empire was on the verge of falling. The Holy Roman Emperor wrote a letter to the Pope, Urban II, asking for help, and he responded by calling for what became the First Crusade in December of 1095. Tens of thousands of Europeans went east and had a surprising amount of success. By 1099, they had captured Jerusalem, and by 1107, they had set up several crusader states. Future crusades would be launched in an attempt to protect these states or reconquer territory that was lost. People of European Christian descent would retain at least some control of land in the area until 1291, when the last of the Crusader states fell. Now, that brings us to the main topic of today's video, alliances that occurred between Muslims and Christians during this time. So while religion was undoubtedly important to people at the time, if it wasn't, something like the Crusades wouldn't have been possible, religion was not the sole motivator for either Muslims or Christians in the region. People on both sides were willing to enter into alliances against common enemies. In particular, I want to talk about 4 times when this occurred. There are about a dozen examples of these types of alliances, and I chose the 4 I'll talk about in this video because I think they do a good job of conveying the different circumstances under which the alliances can occur, as well as the fact that they occurred throughout the period of the Crusades, that is between 1095 and 1291. It was a common occurrence for both of those centuries. So the first alliance I want to talk about involves a conflict where 2 different pairs of interfaith alliances went to war against one another. So in 1104, Baldwin II, the Count of Edessa, he was the ruler of that county of Edessa, the Crusader state, and he was captured in a battle by Jawali, the ruler of Mosul. In the meantime, a Frankish noble named Tancred was his regent. Suffice it to say, Tancred was not a guy with the best reputation at the time or, handed down all through history. He's not usually very positively reviewed. He's constantly on the hunt to gain any territory he can, and he tried to take advantage of the situation while Baldwin was in captivity. Baldwin's ransom was ultimately paid in 1108, and he returned to Edessa after agreeing to a few concessions. This involved the release of some Muslim prisoners, the construction of a mosque in Edessa, and an agreement to entertain future talks of an alliance between the 2 parties. So when Baldwin returns to Edessa, Tancred tries to take advantage of the situation and seize power, but no one in Edessa is willing to rally behind him. He's not very well liked, and he's forced to return to Antioch, and Edessa is back in Baldwin's hands. In the meantime, though, Radwan, the Muslim ruler of Aleppo, was concerned with the relationship between Baldwin and Jawali, which he saw as a threat against him. He saw Tancred as a perfect ally for his cause, since he was no fan of Baldwin II. Late in 1108, Baldwin and Jawali planned an attack on Aleppo, with the plan of attacking Antioch after that. Baldwin would get Antioch while Jawali would get Aleppo. Tancred went to Aleppo to meet up with Radwan and come up with a plan for dealing with this potential attack on Aleppo. Tancred went to meet Radwan in Aleppo to come up with a way to counter the potential attack on the city of Aleppo, and ultimately Tancred and Radwan decide that they're going to have a preemptive strike. They attack Baldwin and Jawali's army at Turbessel in September 1108 within the county of Edessa, and they rout their army, and it puts an end to any threat to Aleppo. This type of alliance really illustrates that local regional interests and desires to expand territory overruled any sort of concern about the religion of one's allies, even in the early stages of the crusading period. After all, Jerusalem had only been captured for about a decade by the time this alliance occurred. You might think alliances like this, where a Christian allies with an Islamic power to fight against other Christians, are exceedingly rare, but they weren't. Let me give you another example of this type of alliance. In 1131, there was a lot of outrage over the coronation of King Fulk of Jerusalem. He gained the crown through his marriage to Baldwin II's daughter, Melisende. Meanwhile, Hugh, the Count of Jaffa, who was Melisende's cousin, claimed that he should be king. He wanted to be king enough that he decided to ally himself with the Fatimid Caliphate, based in Egypt. With Fatimid help, he rebelled against Fulk's rule. In the end, Hugh failed, but he gives us another example of this type of alliance where a Christian crusader allies himself with a Muslim power to fight against a fellow Christian. As you may have gathered from the earlier examples we've discussed, Islamic power in the region is highly fractured during this time. That's part of what allows the Crusaders to be so successful on the First Crusade. They don't encounter sort of a focused resistance to their attacks. There's lots of internal conflicts going on within the Islamic powers in the region, and all of that starts to shift a little bit with the rise of a man named Zengi, who sought to unify the Islamic cities in the region, and he began to do so in the 1140s when he brought both Damascus and Aleppo under his control, and he was intent on conquering all Islamic territory in the region, and then also pushing out the Crusaders. In fact, he uses the idea of jihad as a big motivator to help unify people under his rule. The idea that the war against Christians, and this is sort of where we do see this sort of narrative being constructed of Muslims versus Christians. That's what Zengi's trying to do. But he actually kind of fails to completely construct this narrative because lots of other Islamic powers in the region are more concerned about Zengi than they are about the Crusaders. And the Crusaders are concerned about Zengi too, because his goals are ultimately going to be to put an end to the Crusader states. So, the Count of Edessa at this time, a man named Jocelyn II, enters into an alliance with Kara Arslan, who controlled Eastern Asia Minor, and they planned on besieging Aleppo together to weaken Zengi's hold on the region. Ultimately, this alliance ended in complete disaster, especially for Jocelyn, because when he was headed to Aleppo, Zengi took advantage and captured Edessa while he and most of his army were gone. While this alliance didn't work out the way Jocelyn or Kara Arslan hoped, it does illustrate that Muslim and Christian rulers worked together against common enemies. There were several other alliances between Muslims and Christian rulers in the region over the next several decades, including against Zengi's similarly ambitious son, Nur al-Din. So the last alliance I want to go into in some depth is an alliance that occurs during the Fifth Crusade, which happened between 1217 and 1221. So by this point, much of the territory once held by the Crusaders had been lost. Edessa was never regained after it was lost to Zengi, and the bulk of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187. Ultimately, this crusade's goal was to take back territory that had been lost, including Jerusalem, and ultimately the leaders of this crusade decide they actually want to attack Egypt. Cairo is the capital of the Ayyubid Sultanate, a sultanate that is founded by Saladin and is still ruled by his descendants in this period. And they've unified most of the Islamic territory in Egypt and Syria. The leaders of this crusade ultimately decided it would be a good idea to open up a two-front war. If the Ayyubids were able to focus entirely on the crusade invasion of Egypt, the Crusaders were worried about their chances. But they decided to choose an ally, a Muslim ally, to help them create this two-front war. They choose to enter into an alliance with Kakavas I, the ruler of the Seljuk Turks at the time, who also didn't like the Ayyubids since they had ended Seljuk domination in the region. So, at the same time the Fifth Crusade was going on, Kakavas attacked Ayyubid territory in Syria. He's really part of the plan for this entire crusade, despite being Muslim himself. This strategy ended up largely being effective and enabled the Crusaders some serious success early on in their crusade when they captured the important coastal fortress city of Damietta. However, the Crusaders ultimately are very slow to march south to Cairo, and by the time they finally did, Kakavas I had to break off his attack in the north. This allowed the Ayyubids to focus on repelling the crusade, and they did, winning at the Battle of Mansoura and causing the crusade to end in abject failure. But once again, we see Muslim powers happy to team up with crusaders and vice versa. So in short, all of these alliances that I've covered in this video show you a very complicated picture when it comes to the Crusades. They're not just conflicts between Muslims and Christians. Muslims and Christians often work together against a common enemy, and this is something that was relatively common throughout the crusading period. If there was really sort of blind hatred between Muslims and Christians in the Levant during the era of the Crusades, it would be impossible for such alliances to exist, as there would be no trust between the two sides. Muslims and Christians certainly fought one another during the Crusades, but they also fought together sometimes. In next week's video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Crusades. In particular, I want to talk about the culture of people who grew up in these crusader states and how it differs from their counterparts back in Europe. As you might imagine, the people who grew up in these crusader states have a very different culture than that of their counterparts back in Europe. And in fact, one of the key things that makes them different is that they're much more willing to enter into alliances and form treaties with Muslims than their counterparts are back in Europe. And we're going to see that there's this very big point of contention between people who've lived in the Crusader states for a long time and have their own unique culture, and newcomers who come from Europe and have their own idea about how things should be done. So that'll be the focus of our video next time, how unique Crusader culture was. That does it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, do me a favor and like it and share it so that other people can enjoy it too. And if you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.